I would like to introduce Rajmohan Gandhi. Just kind of start with asking each of you, when did you become aware of this enormous legacy? Was it a burden? Was it an opportunity? Was it something that you had to grow into? Please.
So, unlike my cousin, I was born in South Africa. So I didn't meet Gandhi at an early age. I only met him when I was about 7 years old. Growing up under ashram, Phoenix Ashram, which was established by Gandhi, and my father was sent to South Africa to run the Phoenix settlement and to promote all the programs that Gandhi had started in South Africa. So I feel that it was a real privilege growing up there because we had training and an atmosphere which was different from the rest of South Africa. Whereas there was so much of racism, separation, divisions and all that in the rest of South Africa. At Phoenix Settlement, everybody was a human being. We looked upon everyone as a person. We didn't see race until I went to school and realized that I have to go to a separate school. I wasn't conscious of race because we used to have visitors of all races. They were our friends. We grew up with all race groups and we just were not conscious that this person is a white or African and I am Indian or anything like that. It only started when I was at school, because at school I would see that there's the separation. So in that respect, I think it was a real privilege to grow up there, to understand what humanity is all about. Had I not grown up there, I would have been different. And I think that was one of the privileges that I experienced. Also in terms of religious faith, we had prayers every day that we used to recite in all the different faiths. That was a common practice in all the ashrams, Gandhi's ashrams. So from early childhood, it wasn't, I wasn't brought up in one particular faith, but I learned about every faith and have known, as my parents and my teaching was that every faith should be respected, you should understand, and we should have no problems in praying in all the different faiths, because each one teaches you something unique. And so take the best from each one. So if I were to say any more, I'd be sitting here the whole night, and you will be sitting here the whole night. So I'll leave it at that.
Will you allow me to make one or two general remarks before I respond to your question? First of all, I thank you for this amazing initiative. I think to bring together the descendants of Martin Luther King Jr., Cesar Chavez, and Mohandas Karamchand Gandhi is a wonderful idea. So these three persons and their amazing colleagues, these three could not have achieved what they did without their associates and colleagues. So when we speak of these three, we're also thinking of all their wonderful associates. Because of these amazing people, the world understood that humanity, above all, had to have the component of equality. Because of these three and their associates, the world understood that humanity had to respect one another. And they understood that humanity had to be friendly to, if possible, love one another. So that was an incredible legacy of these three and their associates, of which you are a scholar. I've been a bit of a scholar of that also. But today, the reason why this assembly of everybody, all of us together, is so important is because today, equality, mutual respect, mutual friendship is not the norm in so many places. Supremacy is the norm. Ill will is the norm. Disrespect is the norm. Humiliation is the norm. So we are having this conversation at a time when the norm that these three incredible people and their amazing associates established, those norms are being challenged and in fact being reversed. So I ask your forgiveness for making this general statement. Now on when you're forgiven. So her father was Gandhi's second son. Gandhi had 4 sons, no daughters. My father was the youngest of the 4 sons. I had the good fortune, she was raised in South Africa. I was raised in New Delhi, India, where my father, Gandhi's youngest son, was the editor of a newspaper, and where, fortunately for me, in the last 2 or 3 years of his life, Gandhi spent great chunks of that period in India. Now, he did not stay in our home. Rightly or wrongly, family first was not Gandhi's motto. Rightly or wrongly, boldly, probably insanely, he decided that he would try and make all of India his family. And so everybody had equal claim on his time. He didn't stay with us, but I did see a lot of him. So when he was going from 76 to 78, I was going from 10 to 12. And I saw a good deal of him, especially at this 5 p.m. multi-faith public prayer meeting, where hundreds of people, sometimes thousands of people came, and I was often there with my siblings, taking part. And at the end of these prayers, he would give his comments on what was happening in India, political comments also, social comments, what life was like, what needed to be done as he saw it. Now, as Ila mentioned, this was one of Gandhi's, you might say, innovations, which is now fairly popular the world over, that when good people of all kinds meet, let them remember or recite wonderful verses from different religions. So one of the verses that was recited at these prayer meetings that I would attend often was the first verse of the Quran, the Al-Fatiha. It takes about 1.5 minutes. And if you read the meaning, it is quite a remarkable text. But we are speaking of 1946, 47, 48, when India was becoming independent, but also was becoming partitioned, when killings were taking place. Hindus and Sikhs and Muslims, ritual killings, terrible killings. So in the midst of this situation, Gandhi is holding his prayer meetings with Hindu texts, Christian texts, Zoroastrian texts, Sikh texts, Islamic texts. So people would sometimes, I'm with him, not very far from him, we're sitting on some kind of a platform and there are hundreds of people in front. So this Al-Fatiha is recited and some people stand up and say, "We don't want to hear this, stop it." And I'm sitting very close to him, I'm trying to figure out how is he going to deal with this. And he says to them, "Do you know what this says? You know the meaning? If you read the meaning, you will like it." And he would ask the others, do you object to this? No, we don't object, everybody would say. All right. So he would say to the protesters, please withdraw your objection. And generally they would withdraw. Sometimes they did not withdraw. So then Gandhi would say, all right, I will not compel you to listen to this. But then if you compel me not to have this, I will also not then have the other texts, including the Hindu texts. And I would move straight to my utterance, my post-prayer speech. So I said to myself, I'm 10, 11, 12, that this man is not afraid. Then I asked myself, if these people who are angry at him were to come and physically attack him, what would be my duty? Would I be able to protect him? He had, of course, no bodyguard. He had no shield. But I said to myself, this man, A, he's not afraid. This old man is my grandfather. And B, he speaks quite courteously to those who are speaking pretty roughly to him. So that is when I understood. Of course, the fact that so many people were coming to hear him made it obvious that he was regarded by many as a special individual. But more than that, just as a human being, I felt that I was in the presence of, yeah, he was my grandfather, but there was something very special about him. So that's when I learned by myself, for myself, that there was something special about him.
I just wondered if you would reflect a little bit. I know I'm skipping around, but you were also very, as you said, involved in the anti-apartheid movement. And I wonder about, if you'd say a few words about the importance of Gandhian ideas as it developed in the anti-apartheid movement.
So I think the most important legacy for South Africa was the nonviolent movement. Or he coins the word satyagraha in South Africa. So that movement continued because he established Congress, the Natal Indian Congress, and there was a Transvaal Indian Congress and a Cape Indian Congress, and the three bodies came together to form the South African Indian Congress. Now, one would wonder why the tags, why Indian? Well, South Africa was divided into different race groups, and each race group had its own experiences of apartheid. It wasn't exactly the same. So, it's like the way the apartheid government treated the people. They were white people who would get the most amount, then colored people and Indian people who would get the second, and at the bottom of the range would be African people. So African people would be the most oppressed. And because there was that kind of separation, when you look at the issues that were faced by people, there were also different issues. And so our political organizations were all, different race groups had their own. So you had the African National Congress, you had the Indian National Congress, and so on, or the Natal Indian Congress, not Indian National, that's the India Congress. So we had these different congresses. Now, my father was very much involved in the movement as well. And as a little girl, I used to accompany them when they went on their big rallies and defiance campaigns and so on. We used to accompany them and sing the freedom songs. Songs were very important in those days. And that sort of gave us that feeling of, wanting to do something about this terrible system in South Africa. And I grew into it. When I was at university, we also protested about the conditions at university, we weren't allowed to go to the university where the white students went. We had a separate university. The same lecturers would come, but they would lecture to us in the evenings. After they lectured to the white students, then they come. We didn't have access, we were not allowed to go to the library or to use any of the facilities that they had. It was the same university. We got the degree from the same university, but we had all separate campuses and so on. And we didn't have many facilities like sports facilities, libraries, and things like that. We had to ask our lecturers to bring us books from the library if we wanted to read. Or we could go to the public library, and even those were segregated. So we suffered a lot of hardships, and we knew what the segregation is all about, and we couldn't leave it. We had to do something about it. So from those days, I mean, I can't pinpoint a day, but I've been active in the movement, and it carried on until I was house arrested, and for 9 years I was incarcerated. But after that, we continued with the mass democratic movement and participation in the
Explain
UDA.
why you were incarcerated.
Yeah. Sorry.
Why?
Why I was incarcerated? Well, they don't give you a reason, firstly. They don't give you a reason, but we know that when you are participating in politics, there is a chance that something will happen. They either arrest you and lock you up. When they arrest you and put you in prison, they have to support you. So it costs them money to support you in prison. It's easier to keep you in house arrest because you support yourself. So we thought that that is the reason anyway, that they house arrested and then put us in prison. Also the second reason is that they had nothing. We weren't doing anything illegal. We were protesting against something that was illegal, that was unjust. And natural law, if you look at natural law, it was against the natural law. So we were protesting against that, but that is how the government operated in those days.
The last time we saw each other, it was when your biography came out. And one of the things I was struck by in reading it was that you were pretty honest about Gandhi's limitations, his flaws. I don't know whether you would call them that. We could also just call them his human traits. But I just wondered if writing about him and studying the documents affected your, I mean, this was a person you knew personally, and yet you had to come back and write about him in a way that was scholarly and more objective. So would you just comment on what you went through with that?
Yes.
By the way, I would recommend his biography. It's a wonderful book.
Thank you, Dr. Carson. Thank you for those kind remarks. It wasn't easy to face the limitations, flaws. I think there's nothing wrong in those words, limitations, flaws, humanity of my grandfather. And I loved him, of course, very much. He loved me also. He was, he hugged me and he embraced me, and I was conscious of his love for me. I was so to recognize and write about his limitations and flaws was certainly not easy for me, but it was highly necessary for me. And I think I perhaps now love him more because I'm conscious of his flaws and limitations. And I feel I can relate to him, and all of us can relate to him more if we know him as a human being with weaknesses, of course, an extraordinary human being. As I said earlier, and this is my assessment as a student of the world and of, you might say, history of the last 100 years or so of the world. That yes, Gandhi, King, Cesar Chavez, and people like that, they led the way to make equality, mutual respect, mutual love the norm for the world. Something phenomenal. And if you'll allow me to say this, Dr. Carson, this is a wonderful get-together. I mean, for me to meet MLK III and his daughter and Cesar Chavez's family is such a thrilling thing for me. I've had the privilege, incidentally, of meeting Daddy King, MLK's father, Junior, in Atlanta in '57. Now, and I had the privilege of meeting Cesar Chavez also. It is, in my humble opinion, and in my frank opinion, it's not enough for us to be stirred, to be moved, to see these three families together. Today in the United States, if I may say so, and I live here these days, I've been living here for many years. Once the African Americans, those connected with Latin America, those connected with India, if these groups and other groups of this kind come together and really get to know one another, a photo op of the Gandhi family, King family, Cesar Chavez family is one thing, but all of us have got to really get to know one another very deeply, to study one another's story wholeheartedly, to embrace the story, to embrace the lives. There's one man here in the front row, a man called Sudarshan Kapoor. He's one of the very few Indians who has written about the African-American leaders of the United States. All of us in India say, oh, fantastic, Gandhi King, fantastic, Gandhi King, fantastic. But very few of us have really studied slavery in the United States, the history of the civil rights movement, the life of Martin Luther King Jr., and many others. So I'm really taking this chance. But then you give me this chance. And all of us are here. The family is one thing, but all of us are the family. Some of us may have the blood, but all of us have the spirit. And that's far more important. But unless we with an Indian background, or with an African American background, or with a Hispanic background, or any other kind of background here, unless we really get to know one another, then this celebration is really less than limited. And once we get together in a deep way, and the solidarity includes real intimate knowledge of one another, the US and the world will see the difference. Thank you.
Well, Ela, I know that the last time I saw you, actually, we were part of a gathering that was somewhat similar to this. It brought together descendants of Cesar Chavez and Dolores Huerta. It brought together Martin Luther King III, and you were there. And it was, so it's obvious that you think that there's something of importance to be gained from this. And I think that that's what you're expressing, is that this is not just a photo op. This is not just a wonderful opportunity to see people with these last names, but rather this is something that's got to mean much more than that going forward. So I wondered if you would say a few words just to finish up this part of the session.
I think, like Monpai has said, there's tremendous synergy between the different, aspects that all three have touched on. I think, Cesar Chavez's, involvement with the workers and the agricultural or the agrarian movement is so important. Gandhiji also wrote about it, but I think the practice was here. That's the legacy that he left. And Martin Luther King in the civil rights movement, it's a legacy that he left there. So in different ways, but the same objective of wanting a better world for the people. And I think when we look at a better world, what we see today is violence, all kinds of violence, domestic violence. You see violence against women and children, which is growing all over the world. You see wars, little wars, internal wars, and so on all over the world. We see environmental degradation, and you see the rising inequalities, or the big gap between the rich and the poor. So you have the ultra-rich over there, and you have the very poor who are struggling to survive out there. Now, how to bridge that gap? And when you bring these three great minds together, I think that we can begin to look at the way to bring a change in what's happening. So I think, we talked about it earlier, where to from here? And that question was asked many years ago. Unfortunately, we haven't followed it up. Regardless of what little movements have done all over the world, we need a much bigger effort, a united effort, in order to overcome that problem of violence, of environmental degradation, and the inequality. If we can overcome those three aspects, we can say that we are going to leave a better world for the next generation. Otherwise, there might not be a world for the great-grandchildren.
Thanks so much for that. And actually, that is a wonderful transition to bringing out Martin and the star of the family, Yolanda. So would they please come to the stage? Thank you. Good to see you. Why don't you take? All right. Good to see you. That's okay. That's okay.
See you again. See you again.
Well, good to see you. And this is obviously not the first time I've seen you, and I haven't seen her in a good while. But we were just ending on that wonderful conference. I think it was in Toronto, and you were working, doing the Realizing the Dream, and I worked with you on that. And also we had the pleasure of traveling in India together to mark the 50th anniversary of your father's trip. So we were just ending on this note of why do this? Why is it important to bring together these legacies? And I just wonder if you'd have some thoughts about why you think it's a good idea and useful to work on bringing together these legacies.
First, let me just say we are honored to be here at Stanford and to be certainly with you, Dr. Carson, but also with members of Mohandas K. Gandhi's family who We are a little bit past the birthday celebration. But when you think about 150 years, what does the world look like in relationship to 150 years? And the work in general, I guess we have to define what the work is, because we are living in a very unique period in the history of our nation and the world. It feels as if some leadership around the world is working to divide people through a concept that some would define as nationalism. And we see that in our nation, we see that in ways in India, we see that in Brazil, we see that in Europe and other parts of the world, in the Middle East to some degree. And I think human beings have got to learn how to live together by treating each other with dignity and respect. I'm going to get to your question in a minute, Dr. Carson, by the way. So I know I'm just sharing a few things to hopefully set up a context. But because of where we are, there really is a unique opportunity for these legacies, the three that are here and more, the Mandela legacy as well, in addition to the Gandhi, the King, and the Chavez. And there are others in the world. Because if our world is going to move forward, we have to move in a different direction. So these legacies personify something unique. When you talk about nonviolence, and Mohandas K. Gandhi being the preeminent leader of a nonviolent movement, that Martin Luther King Jr. embraced and actually executed here in the United States effectively. I think we are at this point where these legacies can only grow because they deal with the future. If we chose to go down a different path of some of our leaders today, we will destroy ourselves. Dad used to say, we must learn nonviolence or we will face non-existence. And in our nation, which influences the world so much or has a tendency to, we've got to learn that message. We've got to, this is going to not sound right, but because it's not a good example, but in theory, you can never create a nonviolent society or by exhibiting violence. In other words, violence can't create nonviolence. We are today embracing a culture of violence. We accept it, whether it's through our entertainment, every aspect of our entertainment, whether it's through our video games, even cartoons. They've changed some now, but they used to promote violence. We've got to find a way to create a culture of nonviolence. And I think these legacies have led the world in models that can work. Now, we've got to tweak the models because what was done in the legacies of our parents and grandparents needs to be done in a different way today. But believe me, it's probably the only way that one of the few ways that humankind will survive. So I'll stop. I have a tendency to talk too much. My grandfather used to say, I don't want to run the risk, this is Martin Luther King Sr., that is, Martin Luther King Jr.'s father, of talking more and more and beginning to say less and less. So I'm going to stop for a minute and see what's next.
I wonder if you have some thoughts on that? Because
Why are these legacies important?
yeah.
To help improve our world and our society, in my opinion. We need to have a better world, and we need to make a difference. And everyone here can take action by doing something small, and we can make a difference together, because there are 7 billion people on this planet. And if we each do our part, then we can make the world a better place.
I'm just going to be a reporter here, and I'm just going to find out. When you heard about the shootings at Parkland, what was the process that led you to become involved in that movement against gun violence? I'm just kind of curious. Was it something that?
Could I set a context, if you don't mind?
Okay, sure.
I'm going to be a parental bragger.
Oh, no.
So, and she will tell you additionally, but Parkland, we went in 2016, right?
Like 17.
We went to visit the White House?
Yeah.
We were invited to see, we'd been to the White House a number of times during the administration of President Obama. And I think Yolanda was 8, 7? How were you? 7? She was 7, and my wife and I, Andrea, said, Yolanda, when we go in to see President Obama, although we'd been to the White House, we'd never been in to see the bust of Dad that is still there, but obviously not having any influence on the behavior of the person who inhabits the office today. Anyway, that's a different discussion. But it is there. So we were invited during President Obama's last year to see the bust. And my wife, Andrea, and I said to Yolanda, Yolanda, you've got to come up with some questions to ask President Obama. And we didn't give her any more guidance. So once we got to the Oval Office, President Obama focused on her, as if Andrea and I weren't there, but that's fine. That's what we all do. We focus on those who are coming behind us. And she asked him a question, and we did not give her any guidance. She said, Mr. President, what are you going to do about these guns? Now, that was 2 years before Parkland. So it was not an issue that she came to, all of a sudden, I see people gunned down, and I want to address it. She had already been thinking about this issue and seeing these shootings occurring in our school systems over the years of her at the time, 8 years, 7 years. You were 7, I think, right?
Yeah.
Okay. So I just wanted to set a context.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Now.
So,
Go ahead.
okay. So it's kind of been an issue, especially in our house. We talked about it a lot. And even in school, well, they told us in a different way not to scare us. But in elementary school, we'd have these lockdown drills to protect us just in case something happens, so we know what to do just in case it happened. And that kind of scared me. And on top of that, home, there were mass shootings going on. And it was kind of bothering me. And so I wanted to help. And I got invited to speak at Parkland 4 hours before the event started. And that's when I started getting, I was into it before, but that's when I started really, really working on it. And, yeah.
I want to add one more thing, and I'll please forgive me, but this is parental pride. I guess you're proud, not pride. I'm proud. What Yolanda said was, if I had an opportunity to speak, I would have been politically correct. She put something out in the universe. First of all, she said, my grandfather had a dream. And his dream was to create a world where his children would not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. She said, I have a dream also. And my dream is for a gun-free world. Now, we are politically correct, or we attempt to be. We used to be. That's gone for now. It'll come back. And so my political correctness would have said, we're for the Second Amendment. We are, we're not saying people should not be allowed to have guns. But until you put something in the universe, it can never happen. And that was not something we had anything to do with. This is her own vision. My dream is to have a gun-free world. That's pretty profound.
Absolutely. You have reason to be proud.
I wonder if you would have a few words about just what specific lessons you draw from your father's legacy. I know that people use the term nonviolence, but to me that's kind of a negation of, you can be nonviolent and still be upholding an unjust system. There's lots of ways of, that can be twisted. But I know that you have a deeper understanding because I worked with you for a number of years, and maybe you could get into that of how would you interpret the lesson of your father, because it's often reduced to that kind of simplistic, don't use violence.
Well, the first thing I would say is we have to have a socialization around nonviolence. I mean, we have to teach and train conflict resolution in our school systems. We need a curriculum from first to really through college that people are exposed to every day, because what we are inundated with is negativity. Nonviolence teaches us to operate at a higher level. It's not just forgiveness. It's not just letting someone beat you up. There are strategies that must be employed, and that's what I talk about when I say we need a new way to address, some of these older ideas. I'll give this one example that worked when I was a kid, and what it taught me was really what dignity and respect is about. I was in 3rd or 4th grade, and this kid used to call me the N-word all the time. And he didn't like, we were the first kids to integrate a public school in Atlanta. And so he was a vicious young man. I mean, he was hateful, but he wasn't hateful because of who he was. He was hateful because that was instilled in him in his home. His parents instilled that in him, and he embraced that and carried it to another level. One day, he was a very talented artist, and he was creating a piece of artwork. It was actually a battleship, and it looked very authentic. It looked, for a 3rd or 4th grade kid to do this. Now, I wasn't applauding what he was doing. I was applauding how he did what he did, the talent that he had. So I asked him, I said, I knew what it was. I said, what is that? Battleship. I said, that's really good. And that's the first time he looked up at me as if to say, you think so? And I said, yeah, man, that is really outstanding. Now, that little verbiage changed the way that he interacted with me from then on. He stopped calling me the N-word. He saw me for the first time maybe as a human being. We used to play dodgeball. The kids play, and You know, he used to really try to target me. He stopped doing that. All because of something like a compliment. So again, respect, dignity, worth. This is what nonviolence teaches us, how we teach people how to respect one another in a dignified manner. And I think when we learn that, I mean, even no matter what culture we're from, when we treat people like human beings, I mean, you know, it's like you can't outshoot someone. Yes, you can, but you end up, you know, like the Hatfields and McCoys, everybody would be dead. I mean, and you just kill each other off. But that's, I mean, we're operating at the lowest level today, the way we operate today in violence, as a human being. I mean, you've never seen lower animal form. For example, you've never seen a group of dogs talking about, I'm Christian, I'm Muslim, I'm Hindu, I'm Buddhist, I'm atheist, I'm agnostic, I'm Jewish. They don't have that capacity. You've never seen a group of tigers talking about Shakespeare and, you know, Euripides or Plato, Aristotle. They don't have that ability. You never seen a bunch of cats talking about, I'm Democrat, I'm Republican, I'm independent. But humankind, in my personal judgment, God's highest creation, has the ability to reason. We haven't shown it lately, but we have the ability to be reasonable and operate at a higher level. We have a mind to think. And what we've allowed society to do is to program us. I mean, you know, you talk to those who watch Fox, and they'll tell you it's fair and balanced. And you say, well, what makes you say that? Because that's what they tell you. We're fair and balanced. So, or if you're looking at CNN or MSNBC, who are progressive in one sense. And, you know, we forget that those are businesses first. They are designed to make money, and that's what they promote, what is going to make them money. I'm not suggesting they're bad. Well, you make your own judgment. But I am saying that they are businesses. So what happened to journalism presenting information and you make the decision? They tell us what they want us to know, and we embrace it. We are not thinking. We are being programmed. So nonviolence hopefully teaches us to operate at a much higher level. That's why I said we've got to get above the noise. There's a lot of noise going on. There's so much, we're inundated so much today that we are destroying ourselves. So we have got to create a scenario where we operate at a higher level, like the kids in Parkland. You know, I was saying just earlier, the young lady who's working on climate change, Greta, around the world. Now, why couldn't the president say something like, I don't agree with anything she is saying, but I applaud her for her passion for standing up for an issue? You can still say you didn't agree with her, but the point is, we got to support our young people. We got to lift them up. We don't need to be tearing people down. And that is what we're doing. Now, fortunately, our young people are resilient. And it doesn't matter so much what an adult may say. But it's just sad that a president would focus on a child in that way. We can and we must do better. I know I didn't answer all the questions, but I put a lot out there for folks to think about maybe.
Yolanda, I would imagine you get a lot of questions along the lines of your generation, and as if you could make a statement about a generation. But I just wonder, do you feel that there is a special role that your generation can play in terms of where the world is right now? Because I sense that kind of activism on not just climate issues, as we saw with Greta, on economic issues, now that there is a sense that we need to take on the responsibility in a way kind of similar to what happened in the 60s. And do you see that?
Mm-hmm. So I think every generation had a type of activism. But some generations happen to have more than others. This generation, my generation, lots of people have been into activism with different subjects. Climate change. There were actually a few kids from my school that there was like a rally thing about climate change because they were doing it all over the world. And there was one in Atlanta, and these 2 8th graders participated in it. And like for our middle school assembly, they were telling us the cheers and what they did. And I thought that it was powerful. And there are some things that sometimes I do get disappointed in, but I'm pretty proud of my generation.
And you've got a long way to go with it. So when you come to Stanford, you'll have to keep up that activism. So I guess the final question I would address to you is that when we look at Gandhi, we look at Martin, what about the women? What about the spouse? And I'm just wondering if both of you would comment on, because obviously for me, I saw Martin up on a pedestal, and I never got closer than at the March on Washington, and I was a long way away. But I worked with your mother for a number of years, and I feel that her role sometimes gets underplayed. And I know Kasturba doesn't get the attention. So I wonder if, before we bring out the next group, would you just make some comments along those lines?
Absolutely, I'd be honored to. The first thing I want to say is that I must applaud you also and all of your team that has worked for 20 years almost?
Longer than that.
Longer than 20? Longer than 20 years on
By the way, your mother came to Stanford.
project. And Mom handpicked Dr. Carson.
Yeah.
Well, I don't know if that's how you characterize it, but the reason she wanted to have a person of his stature and ilk who she knew would actually present the true, not legacy, but the true scholarly works of Martin Luther King Jr. Because I don't think, I've said often that when this project is complete, Dad is looked at as a global civil and human rights leader, but people forget the scholarship. And this validates the scholarly work of this amazing, I don't know how he and his team were able to do all that they did, and how he, period, was able to do what he did. And these kind of individuals come along every now and again. This does not happen. And so, number one, Mom had the vision to choose you. That's first. And I thank you and your team for what you all have done over all these years. Secondly, Mom was a true partner. She was not, in the old sense, somebody who was in the background and just stood behind. Our society used to say, a good man needs a woman behind them. Mom was right there the whole way. Dad used to often call her to get her advice because she was involved in the peace movement before him. In fact, when they met at Boston University, when he was at Boston University and she was at the Boston Conservatory, it was the books that they had read that they were able to have great discussions on. And so, as I said, she was involved in actually involved in peace demonstrations before Dad physically got involved. So they were a partnership.
That was Women's Strike for Peace, right?
Yes, oh yeah. I mean, and then of course, after Dad's death, it was really Mom who worked with, she met with every member of Congress, at least every senator and most of the congresspersons, to institutionalize the work through having a King holiday. That didn't happen by accident. Yes, Stevie Wonder was very much involved, and a lot of people. But she independently met with every United States senator. She met with most of the 435 Congress members, if not at least 90% of them. And so, and then to build a King Center. Now, Dad was killed on April 4th, 1968. And by early June, 2 months later, the King Center was created. How do an institution like that generally takes a couple years to plan at least and structure it. But it was up and physically running. Now, not the actual physical site. It took years to raise money and actually have the physical site, which Mom called a living memorial. So she and a team of people, friends and family, created, 2 months after Dad's death, the Martin Luther King Center. Over a period of time, created one of the largest archives and certainly with Dad and the civil rights movement. And other things. Of course, Dr. Carson has been down to the center many times, and of course, all those papers at some point have been created or duplicated so that the project could actually be done. In addition to that, I said the holiday, and the list goes on and on of all the things that Mom was able to do, but I will say that she was a true partner of Dad. She was not someone in the background, and Mom was very strong in her opinions, and I think Dad often listened to her, and probably he'd say when he made some mistakes, it was maybe because he didn't listen. So whatever those mistakes were, but I think that part of our job, myself and even Yolanda, Renee, if she chooses, is to continue to build upon the legacy of our parents. And you're right, Dr. Carson, certainly oftentimes, because Dad's stature is so massive, oftentimes, Mom is not forgotten, never forgotten, but it's diminished. But the reality is, her footprint was certainly very significant, and I think continues to be even today. I remember one of the organizing efforts. She was very much involved in organized labor, and 1199, which the Hospital Workers Union. Of course, unions are getting beaten up today pretty badly, and yet. There's a bigger issue that has nothing to do with what we're talking about today, but I'm going to raise it anyway because I want somebody to help me determine what the answer is. And that is, yes, we still will need unions, but in a diminishing economy where in a couple to 5 years, all the truck drivers, there won't be any drivers. All the Uber drivers. There will be Uber cars, and there will be Lyft cars and others, but driverless cars. My big question is, how are people going to make a living? How are we going to be employed? We need to be talking about these things because they are real. What is Yolanda and her generation, what are they going to be doing? What kind of opportunities? And no one, to my knowledge, I know it's being talked about, but I don't know the answer because the jobs are leaving. And that's a very serious issue. Anyway.
I think that's a good way to transition to the next stage because it does have to do with unions and labor. And so I'll bring out our final two guests.
Viva la causa.
Viva. You know, you probably were listening backstage, and I got into the question of what about the women? And obviously, when we talk about Cesar Chavez, we also mean Dolores Huerta. And it's, so maybe that might be the best way of transitioning into a discussion of what part of the legacy are you see yourself carrying on? How much has that affected your lives? Maybe we could just start with that, and either one of you could start out with the answer.
Well, I just know that my mother thinking and questioning of authority, and they don't take everything that is said as the truth, and they're not willing to accept it as the because you said it, it is so. And so I think that can be a little bit annoying to some of us from the older generation, or like, why do you question everything? But I think it's important that they do that because we had really up until the time that I was in college, like don't question the heroes. These are our superheroes. They are exalted above all, and they can do no wrong, and they're superhuman. And it's like, I was related to these people. They're not super, they're flawed. They're human. And I think that any of us who are come from, descendants of these people who are our heroes, and I, heard mention of it before, like we understand that they were human. And I think that there is a danger to lift someone up. People say, oh, Dolores, you're like Wonder Woman. And he says, there's no such thing as Wonder Woman. There's no such thing as Superman. Those are fantasies. We are wonder people. And we all have the ability to make change. Some get recognized more because we as humans have that desire to lift someone up as the gold standard, but it is helpful for the young people to question and know that, okay, they did a lot, but they were flawed. They were human, just like me. So if they can do that, so can I.
You were mentioning the resistance to doing old-fashioned door-to-door organizing. One thing that occurred to me is that tendency that many people, maybe who go to Stanford, want to change the world. The first tendency is to form a nonprofit. And I'm just wondering if you could comment on, you kind of somewhat skeptical about using social media, but yet it's there, it's a technology. I just wondered if you would have some thoughts about how you use it effectively in a way that works.
I think we do our best. We're not out of Silicon Valley. The best users of tech and the greatest minds are not coming to work in the Central Valley for little to no pay. So we don't have that advantage. So I think we do the best that we can, and we try to learn from other movements who have been successful, use best practices. I think that we're still far behind the game. When we're trying to compare ourselves with corporate America and how they've been able to use these, mass messaging platforms to sell stuff to us, they're doing a lot better. So we're just still, you know, taking baby steps and trying to learn how to sell our message, which is, you know, nonviolent resistance, collective action to make great change. So I would say that we're trying. We're trying our best and we're trying to catch up.
I completely agree. It's just it's another tool in the organizer's kind of toolbox, if you will. And so yeah, like Juanita was saying, we're all learning our best how to, you know, convey that message authentically. And really, I think the heart can still be felt, even if it's through, you know, social media. But nothing's stronger than sitting down at a table in somebody's home who's opened up their house to you and their neighbors and has broken that bread. It's one of the most immediate ways to build trust and to build a community and develop just that undergirding faith that's needed to sustain a movement when the money goes away, when the attention isn't there.
I mean, we have the reality of, we have to deal with the reality of a lot of the communities that we are trying to organize don't have internet access. They're not, you know, we send out an email blast. It may only be to a fourth, you know, or 1/5 of the people who attended the meeting because they didn't put anything in the email category. So it really is still, you know, we do still have to do the on the ground, people to people.
I wanted to leave some time, and I told you about this earlier, that where you can kind of direct questions to one another. And I just wondered if you had any that you're curious about. You have one of the leading experts in terms of scholarship on Gandhi. You have someone who's spent her life in carrying out his ideals. Obviously, the King family, and you have questions.
I have a question for Yolanda. I would like to know what movements are you most passionate and helpful about at this time?
Probably the movement with the shootings, the ones that the Parkland kids are into. And that's my main movement. I support the other movements as well. And I want to work, one of my goals is to work a little more on climate change as well, because we can't address these other issues if we don't even have good climate. Because if you think about it, the human generation could become extinct if we keep doing what we're doing. Maybe not until like 100 or 200 years or 1,000 or many years later, but for the people before us. And we can't address these issues if our climate isn't well, because there won't be any more humans.
See, in South Africa at the moment, we are struggling with question of land redistribution, because, you know, the land was, you know about it. So I'd just like to ask, how do you see South Africa resolving that kind of problem? And perhaps, you know, would they, I know we talked about technology, besides the, you know, Instagram and all those kinds of technology, we could have sort of conferences without having to come physically to the US, and, you know, video conferences and so on. Just at least amongst a few people to get information, to share information. Would you feel like that is a technology you would like to use? So 2 questions. How you'll deal with the land question, and if you would be happy to have that kind of technology.
And who's your question directed to?
Yes.
I think nonviolent resistance, for one, is a great way to, you know, make huge change, and you know that. I think also making your movement sharing it far and wide, making it accessible for everyone around the world. The California grape growers never would have caved if 17 million people did not stop buying the grapes. So I think that economic boycotts, I don't know if that's legal there, but I think that economic boycotts always have incredible power. And we've seen people remove economic benefits from states who are taking away women's rights. We've seen the power of the purse work very effectively. Always nonviolent resistance, and I think getting older people involved. I don't know if everyone knows or heard that my mother is 89 years old and she was just arrested in Fresno, California, for standing up for workers' rights. I don't think they knew who they were arresting. But she knew exactly what she was doing. And she said, I decided to get arrested because the sheriffs were mistreating the people who I was peacefully protesting with. And so she chose to make herself a part of that. Jane Fonda, in her 80s, just got arrested with protesting with Greta Thunberg in New York or Washington, D.C. I'm not sure, but somewhere on the East Coast. So I think definitely, I learned a song, one day an army of gray-haired women will quietly take over the earth. Certainly getting all generations involved, because our elderly people are like, they've been there, they have the experience, and they can get attention when they're doing peaceful protests, and the young children as well, you're teaching them, carrying on the legacy for the future, and if you're trying to get your message out to a wide number of people, then the technology is certainly important. But I think that you have to give everybody a role in what they're good at, right? So maybe certain people in the movement are not going to be the best at the technology, but you find those millennials who are very invested in your cause, and you get them to do that technology work for you. So.
I got a comment and a question. Well, it seems like we as a society have lost our humanity, and we have got to find a way to re-engage in humanity. And oftentimes leadership does start, or many times it has been at the top, but it perhaps has to come from the bottom up at this particular point. But I was going to ask about the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, because it appeared to be very effective for what maybe there were certain specific goals that it was achieving at that specific time. And we've never really had that even in the U.S. We've done wonderful things, but when you talk about land repatriation, that's a complicated issue, and it is. I've seen it done. I've seen it from afar. I've seen some of the leadership who are very passionate about it, and I don't know that anybody has the specific answer because it's just complicated. What I do know is that if you're talking about equity, fairness, and justice, it has to be done. I don't know how to get it done. But I was wondering if the Truth and Reconciliation Commission had any recommendations as it related to that issue, or was that just not one of the issues?
That issue, as far as I know, was not part of the Truth and Reconciliation. Truth and Reconciliation Commission concentrated on people who were, unfairly treated, killed, some of them in, conditions where there was secrecy and so on. So in the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, they had an opportunity to come out and say what happened. So you hear both sides of the story, and the perpetrators were given an opportunity to come out and confess. So that was important in that respect. But even then, there are a lot of cases that are still coming up of people, who were ill-treated whilst in incarceration. For instance, there was one case recently where this man was killed whilst he was in detention. And they said he committed suicide. Nobody came and confessed that yes, we killed him. Now they had a case about it, and they found that there was evidence that certain people had actually killed him. So those things are still carrying on, and that bitterness still exists because of that. Also, another defect of whilst there were lots of advantages, the other defect is that when a perpetrator continues to live in the style that he was living in previously, whilst the victims, their families, and they continue to suffer because there is no change in their lifestyle. So, it raises a lot of bitterness that these are people who benefited from the apartheid system and they continue to live. Their children go to better schools, they have better housing, whilst the victims continue to suffer in poverty and struggling. So those are some of the defects when you look at it, but there is a lot of good in the sense that, a non-violent struggle is about being able to have a mutual sort of understanding, mediation at equality level. You understand the other's point of view, they understand your point of view. And the way the mediation happens is where both parties equalize. So both parties are now, there's no loser and no winner, no vanquished and no victor. So that is the essence of nonviolent action. That hasn't happened. We still need to train people and learn that. Yeah.
Unfortunately, we have to bring this discussion to an end. This is a remarkable encounter. Just one final comment. Who is it to?
Okay, it's for you. So for the good communities, which community would you like to help with the crops and plants and land the most? And which one have you mainly been focusing on? And how can technology help?
I'm interested in helping any community that is underserved by our democracy, that is disadvantaged by corporate greed. And so that's a big, huge community. We find in my home area where I grew up in the Bakersfield, Kern County region, we find a lot of people who meet that description. So some people forget about it because it's kind of like they think California is just all about the Bay Area and Los Angeles, but they don't realize there's this whole area in the middle where it's kind of forgotten about. People like to say it's the Alabama of California. So I once said to my mother, why would you settle here in this dusty, dry, terrible air quality, nothing to do place? Right? Why would you make your whole family be condemned to live here? The matriarch we're going to all settle wherever you settle. And she said, because mija, if we're not here to do the work, who will come here to do it? Where the work needs to be done. You got to serve the people who need organizing. That's where you got to be. So that's my community where I'm focusing on now, but definitely like you, interested in all the movements, the youth. I think it's so important that we stop your generation from fearing violence in places where you should have peace and safety, and I think that we should all, be working very diligently to save the planet for your generation. So thank you for your
Clearly, without something such as the Great Boycott, which only worked because lots of people who had never thought about the justice issues relating to a grape were suddenly informed in a way that could help the movement. And I wonder if you can kind of expand on the continuing relevance of tactics like that and strategies like that.
Yeah, well, it's, when we look back and we think about the height of the farm workers movement through the 60s and 70s, the fact that they were able to organize over 15 million, about 17 million people, I think is what they projected through a Lewis something poll. It's quite a testament to how organized they were. And to do that before we have cell phones in our back pockets with access to Facebook and Twitter and Instagram, and we've heard about some of the social movements that they've given rise to because of this instant connection. To imagine that they did this before all of that is incredible. And I think it's a testament to when you don't have the resources or the levers of the power at your hand, what you have is the time and the energy of the community. And the way that you show the full force is by going far together, and you do that through organizing and collective action. And in my work today, working for educational equity and justice in the state of California, it's still very much about how are we organizing this campaign to address this issue? How are we mobilizing the community to make sure that their voices are heard at the decision-making table? So I think, without a doubt, those principles and tactics of community organizing still run through many strands of our work today, whether we call it that or not. And I just feel lucky enough to cherish those principles and to try to do my best to stay true to them.
You want to?
Well, I know that Dolores, my mother and her continued organizing is very excited about all the tools that we have now to quickly mobilize people and quickly get a message spread. But she doesn't abandon the original organizing principles that were taught to her and my Tío Cesar by Fred Ross Sr., who is a gringo, who she likes to call the godfather of the Chicano movement, because he taught those two how to do this house meeting model of organizing. And honestly, we have a hard time training and keeping organizers, because they're like, what is, this is so old fashioned. This is like, so slow. We could reach so many more people if we just go stand and make a Facebook post or pass out some flyers. And she says, no, you have to meet with people, bring someone who is willing to host people in their home, their neighbors, to talk about what issues are impacting them in their daily lives, have them go through a process of prioritizing what issues that they feel are the most important, what issues can really be tackled with advocacy and training and organizing of other community members, and working hands-on leadership development, giving the skills, giving the training, providing the resources so that people can learn to become their own agents of change, to become empowered themselves, to ignite that passion. For once you teach somebody that the power is in their person, that they have the ability to make change when they come together in collective action, you can't extinguish that fire. And it spreads also like fire. Maybe spreading fires is not a great analogy at this moment, but in California, they're so willing once they find that voice to continue to use it. And it's like magic when someone realizes, I did that. I made that change. I learned how to make an impact at my school board. I learned how to make an impact at my city council. I actually got some policy, favorable policy passed, or something stopped that was going to hurt my community. And once that happens, you know, it just really does spread. So, you know, she doesn't abandon that original house meeting model that they were originally taught. And that's what our organizers are trained to do.
That's great. That's great. Since both of you are you know, somewhere in between the youngest generation here and those of us who are older, I'm just wondering, how do you feel this message is getting passed down? I would imagine many of the people who become your organizers are young, college, high school. Maybe you could say a few words about, do you sense that they are getting it? Are you optimistic in terms of moving into the future? Please.
I'll let you speak for the youth.
Okay, I'll do my best. And I have a few more gray hairs now, so I may have lost my youth card. But I used to do a lot of guest presenting and sharing at schools up and down the state and out of state. And you know, I think the final message that I left with was the reminder that my grandfather shared with thousands of students that he spoke in front of. And the final reminder was always, the end of all education should surely be service to others. And I think there's something about young people that already have this generosity of heart and of spirit and of energy that wants to give back in ways that maybe they wouldn't articulate as we are maybe trying to do here on the stage. But when you could connect to that goodness and when you could show that there's an outlet to transform the world and to be that change that you want to see in the world, I think it makes young people really excited. And when we look at some of the movements that we've seen the young people advancing around gun control or around the climate change issues at the moment, you know, I think it gives me a lot of hope. And I'm really excited for just the tenacity and the fierceness and for young people really stepping into their own and not being afraid to speak truth to power. I think in a lot of ways, they're modeling maybe some of the most exemplary behavior of the moment that, you know, maybe we as adults also be following in the footsteps of.
You want to add anything to that?
I think that something important that the youth has now is critical thinking and questioning of authority, and they don't take everything that is said as the truth, and they're not willing to accept it as the because you said it, it is so. And so I think that can be a little bit annoying to some of us from the older generation who are, you know, like, why do you question everything? But I think it's important that they do that because we had really up until the time that I was in college, like, don't question the heroes. These are our superheroes. They are exalted above all, you know, and they can do no wrong, and they're superhuman. And it's like, I was related to these people. They're not super, I mean, they're flawed. They are human. And I think that any of us who are come from, you know, descendants of these people who are our heroes, and I, you know, heard mention of it before, like, we understand that they were human. And I think that it's a danger to lift someone up. You know, people say, oh, Dolores, you're like Wonder Woman. She says, you know, there's no such thing as Wonder Woman. There's no such thing as Superman. Those are fantasies. We are wonder people. And we all have the ability to make change. Some get recognized more because we as humans have that desire to lift someone up as the gold standard, but it is helpful for the young people to question and know that, okay, they did a lot, but they were flawed. They were human, just like me. So if they can do that, so can I.
When you were mentioning the resistance to doing old-fashioned door-to-door organizing, one thing that occurred to me is that tendency that many people, maybe who go to Stanford, want to change the world. The first tendency is to form a nonprofit. And I'm just wondering if you could comment on, you kind of were somewhat skeptical about using social media, but yet it's there, it's a technology. I just wondered if you would have some thoughts about how you use it effectively and in a way that works.
Yeah. I think we do our best. You know, we're not out of Silicon Valley. The best users of tech and the greatest minds are not coming to work in the Central Valley for little to no pay. So we don't have that advantage. So I think we do the best that we can, and we try to learn from other movements who have been successful, use best practices. I think that we're still far behind the game. I mean, when we're trying to compare ourselves with corporate America and how they've been able to use these, mass messaging platforms to sell stuff to us, they're doing a lot better. So we're just still, taking baby steps and trying to learn how to sell our message, which is, nonviolent resistance, collective action to make great change. So I would say that we're trying. We're trying our best and we're trying to catch up. I don't know, Anthony.
Yeah, completely agree. It's just it's another tool in the organizer's kind of toolbox, if you will. And so yeah, like Juanita was saying, we're all learning our best how to convey that message authentically. And really, I think the heart can still be felt, even if it's through social media. But nothing's stronger than sitting down at a table in somebody's home who's opened up their house to you and their neighbors and has broken that bread. It's one of the most immediate ways to build trust and to build a community and develop just that undergirding faith that's needed to sustain a movement when the money goes away, when the attention isn't there.
I mean, we have the reality of, we have to deal with the reality of a lot of the communities that we are trying to organize don't have internet access. They're not, we send out an email blast, it may only be to a fourth, or 1/5 of the people who attended the meeting because they didn't put anything in the email category. So it really is still, we do still have to do the on the ground, people to people.
I wanted to leave some time, and I told you about this earlier, that where you can kind of direct questions to one another. And I just wondered if you had any that you're curious about. You have one of the leading experts in terms of scholarship on Gandhi. You have someone who's spent her life in carrying out his ideals. Obviously, the King family, and you have questions.
I'd like to.
Yes.
I have a question for Yolanda.
Okay.
I would like to know what movements are you most passionate and helpful about at this time?
Probably the movement with the shootings, the ones that the Parkland kids are into. Mm-hmm. And that's my main movement. I support the other movements as well. And I want to work, one of my goals is to work a little more on climate change as well, because we can't address these other issues if we don't even have a good climate. Because if you think about it, the human generation could become extinct if we keep doing what we're doing. Maybe not until like 100 or 200 years or 1,000 or many years later, but for the people before us. And we can't address these issues if our climate isn't well, because there won't be any more humans.
Right, good job.
I had a
Yes, please.
question. Yes.
Sure.
Say in South Africa at the moment we are struggling with question of land redistribution, because the land was, you know about it. So I'd just like to ask, how would you see South Africa resolving that kind of a problem? And perhaps, would they, I know we talked about technology, besides the, Instagram and all those kinds of technology, we could have sort of conferences without having to come physically to the US and, video conferences and so on, just at least amongst a few people to get information, to share information. Would you feel like that is a technology you would like to use? So 2 questions: how you'll deal with the land question, and if you would be happy to have that kind of technology.
And who is your question directed to?
Yes.
I think nonviolent resistance, for one, is a great way to, make huge change, and you know that. I think also making your movement, sharing it far and wide, making it accessible for everyone around the world. The California grape growers never would have caved if 17 million people did not stop buying the grapes. So I think that economic boycotts, I don't know if that's legal there, but I think that economic boycotts always have incredible power. And we've seen people remove the economic benefits from states who are taking away women's rights. We've seen the power of the purse work very effectively. Always nonviolent resistance, and I think getting older people involved. I don't know if everyone knows or heard that my mother is 89 years old and she was just arrested in Fresno, California, for standing up for workers' rights. I don't think they knew who they were arresting. But she knew exactly what she was doing. And she said, I decided to get arrested because the sheriffs were mistreating the people who I was peacefully protesting with. And so she chose to make herself a part of that. Jane Fonda, in her 80s, just got arrested with protesting with Greta Thunberg in New York or Washington, D.C. I'm not sure, but somewhere on the East Coast. So I think definitely, I learned a song, one day an army of gray-haired women will quietly take over the earth. Certainly getting all generations involved, because, our elderly people are like, they've been there, they have the experience, and they can get attention when they're doing peaceful protest, and the young children as well, you're teaching them, carrying on the legacy for the future, and if you're trying to get your message out to a wide number of people, then the technology is certainly important, but I think that you have to give everybody a role in what they're good at, right? So maybe certain people in the movement are not going to be the best at the technology, but you find those millennials who are very invested in your cause, and you get them to do that technology work for you. So, yeah.
Yes. I got a comment and a question. Well, it seems like we as a society have lost our humanity, and we have got to find a way to re-engage in humanity. And oftentimes leadership does start, well, many times it has been at the top, but it perhaps has to come from the bottom up at this particular point. Yeah. But I was going to ask about the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, because it appeared to be very effective for what maybe there were certain specific goals that it was achieving at that specific time. And, you know, we've never really had that even in the U.S. We've done wonderful things. But, you know, when you talk about land repatriation, that's a complicated issue. And it is, I've seen it from afar. I've seen some of the leadership who are very passionate about it. And I don't know that anybody has the specific answer because it's just complicated. What I do know is that if you're talking about equity, fairness, and justice, it has to be done. I don't know how to get it done, but I was wondering if the Truth and Reconciliation Commission had any recommendations as it related to that issue, or was that just not one of the issues?
The land issue, as far as I know, was not part of the Truth and Reconciliation.
Okay.
Truth and Reconciliation Commission concentrated on people who were, you know, unfairly treated, killed, some of them in, you know, conditions where there was secrecy and so on. So in the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, they had an opportunity to come out and say what happened. So you hear both sides of the story, and the perpetrators were given an opportunity to come out and confess. So that was important in that respect. But even then, there are a lot of cases that are still coming up of people, you know, who were ill-treated whilst in incarceration. For instance, there was one case recently where this man was killed whilst he was in detention. And they said he committed suicide. Nobody came and confessed that, yes, we killed him. Now they had a case about it, and they found that there was evidence that certain people had actually killed him. So those things are still carrying on, and that bitterness still exists because of that. Also, you know, another defect of whilst there were lots of advantages, the other defect is that when a perpetrator continues to live in the style that he was living in previously, whilst the victims, their families, and they continue to suffer because there is no change in their lifestyle. So, you know, it raises a lot of bitterness that these are people who benefited from the apartheid system, and they continue to live. Their children go to better schools, they have better housing, whilst the victims continue to suffer in poverty and struggling. So those are some of the defects when you look at it. But there is a lot of good in the sense that, you know, a nonviolent struggle is about being able to have a mutual sort of understanding, mediation at equality level. You know, you understand the other's point of view, they understand your point of view. And the way the mediation happens is where both parties equalize. So both parties are now, there's no loser and no winner, no vanquished and no victor. So that is the essence of nonviolent action. That hasn't happened.
Right.
We still need to train people and learn that. Yeah.
Unfortunately, we have to bring this discussion to an end. This is a remarkable encounter.
We got one
just
more.
one final comment.
Who is it to?
Okay, it's for you. So for the like communities, which community would you like to help with the crops and plants and land the most? And which one have you mainly been focusing on? And how can technology help?
I'm interested in helping any community that is underserved by our democracy, that is disadvantaged by corporate greed. And so that's a big, huge community. We find in my home area where I grew up in the Bakersfield, Kern County region, we find a lot of people who meet that description. So some people forget about it because it's kind of like they think California is just all about the Bay Area and Los Angeles, but they don't realize there's this whole area in the middle where it's kind of forgotten about. People like to say it's the Alabama of California. So I once said to my mother, why would you settle here in this dusty, dry, terrible air quality, nothing to do place, right? Why would you make your whole family be condemned to live here because you're the matriarch and we're gonna all settle wherever you settle? And she said, because mija, if we're not here to do the work, who will come here to do it? So that's where. So, you gotta be where the work needs to be done. You gotta serve the people who need organizing. That's where you gotta be. So that's my community where I'm focusing on now, but you know, definitely like you, interested in all the movements, the youth. I think it's so important that we stop your generation from fearing violence in places where you should have peace and safety, and I think that we should all, you know, be working very diligently to save the planet for your generation. So thank you for your work.
Well, this session, I think all of us would treasure